Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to Sarah and to Andover Newton for extending this invitation to me. I also want to thank my colleague Kehaulani Kaonui at Wesleyan for helping to orient me to Hawaiian history. And there you are. I was like, where is she? And to thank Anka McNeil, who worked as research assistant for me in this project and is now heading off for greater academic challenges as a PhD student at Harvard University. We're very proud of her. So Andover Newton made the dubious decision to ask me to speak about the significance of this anniversary today. They might regret it. To think with you about the history and the ethics of remembering this mission, the good, the bad, and the ugly, 200 years after it began. This is Andover Theological Seminary, the old. I come to this topic not as a Hawaiian or even as a scholar of Hawaiian history, that hence the dubious decision bit, but rather as a faculty member of YDS and Andover Newton, a historian of religion in the United States with interests in the intersections of race, religion, and imperialism in US history. My own life experience as a missionary kid, the daughter of Mennonite missionaries who spent a total of 23 years in 5 different African countries also shapes my approach to this question and really to all of my work. So here's my family in Swaziland looking very 1970s, where, or maybe the cusp of 1980, where my father served for a few years as General Secretary of the Council of Swazi, the Swazi Council of Churches. And I remember my parents wrestling with the place of missions in post-colonial Africa and with the global inequities of race, wealth, and power. So while I'm still pretty new to Hawaiian history, I've been thinking about this complex web of issues for really all my life. Now, thinking globally, missionaries are not always the bad guys. Sometimes, this picture I kind of randomly chose as a group of Japanese evangelists and field workers in Hawaii. I'm not going to be talking much about the Japanese in Hawaii, but just to remind us that there are many peoples there. Sometimes missionaries opposed European and US imperial expansions, even in Hawaii. More often than not, they didn't see eye to eye with colonial authorities in missionary locations around the world. And whatever they did or intended to do, their converts, many of them marginalized and dispossessed by colonialism, and more recently by the neoliberal market economy, embraced Christianity as a resource for themselves. But now this is the Damon family, a missionary family in Hawaii. In contrast to my family, they're looking very 1840s. Whatever the missionaries' intentions, and no matter what resources of faith and empowerment colonized and marginalized people have found in Christianity, most Protestant missions in the 19th and 20th centuries also serve to justify, to smooth the way, and ultimately to facilitate colonial conquest. This was certainly the case in Hawaii. Over the course of half a century, power shifted from the ali'i, the Hawaiian elites, ruling class, to the haole, the white foreigners, missionary descendants prominent among them. In the 1890s, these white residents in Hawaii, mostly missionary, many of them missionary descendants, seized power from the Hawaiian queen, Miliuokalani, turning Hawaii into a colonized territory of the United States. So what does it mean to mark the bicentennial of the ABCFM missions to Hawaii. What does it mean to celebrate or commemorate any past event? Which events we mark as anniversaries, how we choose to commemorate them, reveals whose histories we place at the center of our narratives, and says a lot about who we imagine ourselves to be. Any group defines itself through narratives about its origins and its history. These narratives are always selected from a wide range of past events, so that the moment a group chooses to mark as its point of origin, along with the meanings and sentiments assigned to that point of origin, have the power to reinforce and reshape identities, or even to construct a sense of shared identity for the group. Here's another anniversary that is commemorated in contemporary Hawaii. Hawaii celebrates King Kamehameha Day in 2017. I'll start this afternoon with the early 19th century Protestant missionaries in Hawaii, but we won't linger too long there. Instead, I want to tell a story about how these missions have been remembered and commemorated over time. It's kind of a history of commemorations. We're going to do a whirlwind tour. How these anniversaries were celebrated, mostly in Hawaii, had everything to do with who was celebrating them and what was happening in the larger world at the time. They were tools wielded for effect in their own political moments, and they rose and fell and changed with the times. Along the way, I also want to lift up Native Hawaiian voices, Kanaka Maoli voices, and the anniversaries that they choose to commemorate, like this one. Whether we see the missionaries as saints or as villains, we need to move beyond them to center other voices. Other ways of understanding this history, this anniversary, and maybe even other anniversaries to remember. In his memoirs, A Residence of 21 Years in the Sandwich Islands, the missionary Hiram Bingham, who was a graduate of both Yale College and Andover Seminary, also the grandfather of Yale professor and the famous Machu Picchu explorer Hiram Bingham III. He has a hall named after him at Yale now, where we had a reception the other day. Hiram Bingham remembered observing the first anniversary of the missionaries' arrival in the Sandwich Islands, quote, as a day of thanksgiving and prayer, as it has often been since. By an examination of schools on Oahu and review of our progress. The king invited us to a public dinner, he wrote, at which he presided. The next day, on being assured anew of our unvarying intention to do him good, to elevate the nation, promote their prosperity and salvation, he confirmed the original permission granted us to remain and labor as missionaries. King Kamehameha II, Liholiho, had granted the missionaries temporary and conditional permission to stay in Oahu. This is a later missionary map. By allowing them to stay at all, Liholiho went against the wishes of some of the other ali'i and most of the foreign traders, Americans, British, French, and Spaniards, who used Hawaii as a profitable way station on their whaling and trading routes across the Pacific and feared that the missionaries would interfere. Bingham and his fellow missionaries had arrived at a pivotal moment. The arrival of more and more whaling ships and traders brought social disruptions and new disease epidemics to Hawaii. Only a decade earlier, the powerful King Kamehameha I, pictured here, had unified all the islands under a single monarch for the first time. When he died, his son Liholiho took his place, ruling alongside the powerful Kuhina Nui Ka'ahumanu. Liholiho and Ka'ahumanu then declared an end to the ai kapu, which had traditionally barred men and women from eating together. For a variety of reasons, they had concluded that this taboo, much criticized by the traders, had outlived its usefulness. Missionaries misunderstood and exaggerated the significance of this change, claiming that Ka'ahumanu had ended the heathen idolatry of the islands, and they saw the hand of God at work. The missionaries also saw God's hand at work in the life of Henry Opukahai. Opukahaya, you have to excuse my pronunciation, who had started his training in Hawaii as a kahuna, a priest, before traveling to New England on a whaling ship. Opukahaya had encountered missionary advocates in New Haven and attended the, quote, School for Heathen Youth in Cornwall, Connecticut. Until his untimely death in 1818, he planned to return to Hawaii as a missionary, and his memoirs helped motivate the new mission to Hawaii. He was not alone. Seven other Kanaka Maoli men studied at the Cornwall School, and 4 of them returned to Hawaii with the missionary group. 3 of them, Thomas Hopu, William Kanui, and John Honoli'i, served as interpreters and missionaries in their own right, although they rarely get mentioned in any of the anniversaries of this mission. The missionaries arrived in Hawaii convinced that they brought the light of Christianity to banish the darkness of heathenism. And some of the La'ali'i, most importantly Ka'ahumanu, were convinced that what they offered was good. The Ali'i needed allies against French and British incursions. They wanted to gain the skills of reading and writing. Over time, they would also decide to follow the missionaries' advice to transform the governing structures of Hawaii, to adopt the constitutional legal systems that would make Hawaii legible to the international powers as a sovereign nation, and so fend off colonial conquest. As Hawaiian historians like David Chang and Noenoe Silva have shown, working with Hawaiian language sources, Kanaka Maoli in the 19th century did not see the missionaries' arrival as an origin point, but as a part of a much longer series of arrivals. And they related these arrivals to their own explorations. Pictured here is Samuel Kamakau, a leading 19th century Hawaiian scholar and historian, and his work, Ke Kumu Aupuni. He offered a distinctly Hawaiian history that did not center European arrivals, either Captain Cook in 1778 or the missionaries in 1820. Instead, he celebrated Hawaiian travels and discoveries, and especially Hawaiian rulers and their genealogies. At a time when Hawaiian sovereignty was under assault, he wrote as a Hawaiian nationalist historian who gave Hawaiians, not missionaries, center stage. Not all Hawaiian people agreed that it was wise to accept the missionaries. But Liholiho was convinced that what they brought would augment his authority and help him gain credibility as a sovereign in the eyes of the larger world. The king incorporated the 3rd anniversary of the mission in 1823 into his own ceremony to mark the anniversary of his ascension to the throne. The missionaries used the occasion to preach, calling for, quote, the demolition of idolatry and the establishment of a Christian system in its stead. For Liholiho, though, the main purpose of the event was to mark and solidify his own authority, and for him, the presence of the missionaries attending to him and honoring his reign strengthened that power. Here he is pictured with his wife Kamamalu and their entourage at the theater in London, where they visited on a diplomatic mission in 1824. Unfortunately, both Liholiho and Kamamalu contracted measles and died on that visit in London. His younger brother, Kauui Keaouli, then only 11 years old, became the next Mo'i king, Kamehameha III. Until he grew up, the Kuhina Nui Ka'ahumanu served as the ruling ali'i. Kamehameha III became Hawaii's longest reigning monarch, king for 29 years until his death in 1854 when he was only 40. Through his reign, Kamehameha III saw the missionaries as allies for the most part, yet the missionaries consistently portrayed Native Hawaiians as racially inferior, perpetually in need of their instruction. Consider Bingham's reflections on the 20th anniversary of the mission in 1840. Soon after the king had announced a new Western-style constitution that outlined a new separation of powers between the king, the legislature, and the judges. Kamehameha III aimed to govern his people as a modern ruler. Bingham was impressed, but he did not believe the Hawaiians capable of managing their own affairs. Quote, "The Hawaiian nation, after 21 years of acquaintance with Christianity, is but a youth taken from the filth and rags of heathenism, and now needs the impress which the correct example and counsels of the older and wiser nations of the earth ought in their wisdom be willing to give it." Back in the United States, the Hawaii missions were already fostering explicitly imperialist fantasies. Henry Cheever, the son of a devout congregational family in Maine, members of whom attended Andover Newton, before it was Andover Newton, had traveled to the Sandwich Islands on a whaling ship in the early 1840s. This is his book, Life in the Sandwich Islands. He wrote, "Perhaps it is in the providential plan of the world's great ruler that the Sandwich Islands should yet be adopted into the great American Confederacy. One as they have been from the lowest barbarism by American missionaries, they are destined to be supplanted in numbers and power by a foreign race. They desire us to be their successors and protectors." There's a basic paradox here in the language of successors and protectors. Cheever expected white Americans to succeed, or in other words, to replace the native people of Hawaii. This is a fantasy of displacement and disappearance in which Native Hawaiians supposedly wanted to be replaced, and in the meantime, the missionaries would protect them from the worst ravages of the colonial encounter. This is a picture of a timeline that appeared at an exhibit at Williams College, where Kehaulani and I went in December. That exhibit was wrestling with Williams College's own connection to the history of this mission. Hawaii's alii had to walk a dangerous tightrope, navigating between competing empires to maintain Hawaii's national sovereignty. Many of them converted to Christianity, and with the aid of the missionaries, built a system of law that the rest of the world would recognize as modern. For more than half a century, they succeeded in protecting Hawaii's independence. For much of that time, American missionaries looked like allies in that endeavor. In 1843, seeking a more secure grounding for that independence, Kamehameha III sent his trusted advisor, Timothy Ha'alilio, and William Richards, another Andover graduate, pictured here, on a diplomatic mission to Europe and the United States to secure formal guarantees of Hawaiian independence. Meanwhile, a British consul, backed up by a warship, had unilaterally declared sovereignty over Hawaii in the name of the Queen. Skillful diplomacy by Ha'alilio and Richards in London and by Kamehameha III back in Honolulu resolved the situation, and a new British commander dispatched to Hawaii pronounced this an illegitimate claim, restoring Hawaii's sovereignty. Back in Europe, Ha'alilio and Richards managed to secure formal recognition of Hawaii as a sovereign nation from Great Britain, France, and then the United States. An event celebrated back in Hawaii as La Kuokoa o Hawaii Nei, Independence Day. The Hawaiian Kingdom Independence blog, where I found this image online, is one of many Hawaiian nationalist venues now reviving this holiday in support of the contemporary movement for Hawaiian sovereignty. Hawaiian historians, including Jonathan Osorio, Noelani Arista, and Noenoe Silva, have shown how the same legal structures that worked for half a century to protect Hawaiian sovereignty, in combination with the racist paternalism of the missionaries and the growing Haole missionary business community in Hawaii, also undermined Hawaiian cultural and political autonomy, and so would enable the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893. One of the most important steps in that process was the Great Mahele of 1848. This was a law, promulgation policy law that divided up and privatized land ownership, ending the traditional system of communal land ownership under the management of the ali'i. Kamehameha III was convinced by his missionary advisors that this reform would benefit the kingdom by inspiring the common people to, quote, work hard for material rewards in the emerging capitalist economy. And by easing international commerce and treaty making, the end result was that wealthy ali'i and haole business owners gained control over the kingdom's land and wealth. Although the common people could obtain small individual land allotments, these did not match up with their traditionally wide-ranging land use practices. Many became landless wage laborers in a new plantation economy. And these are some of the people that profited from that economy. Missionaries in Hawaii were intimately involved in this new economy. William P. Alexander left the mission to work as a land surveyor in the 1850s and opened his own sugar plantation in 1862. One of his sons became a partner in the Big Five Sugar Company, Alexander and Baldwin. Their ad up here. On the right is Amos Starr Cook from Danbury, Connecticut, who went to Hawaii as a missionary in 1837, and then in 1851, as the ABCFM began to reduce funding to the missions, co-founded Castle and Cook, another Big Five company. These are just two of the many, many, many stories like this. Many Kanaka Maoli people worried about the growing power and wealth of the American missionary community. When the new king, Kamehameha IV, was crowned in 1862, he and his queen Emma invited Anglican missionaries to found a new Anglican church in Hawaii. They had family ties to the Church of England, and the pageantry of the High Church appealed to them as a way to symbolically bolster the authority of the monarchy. No doubt they also hoped to bring in British influence at this point to counteract the Americans, as they had once brought in the Americans to counteract the British. Today, the Episcopal Diocese of Hawaii honors King Kamehameha IV and Queen Emma with the Feast of the Holy Sovereigns every November. These images come from the website of the Episcopal Diocese of Hawaii. I'm not embarrassed to get my PowerPoint images online. For some Hawaiians, the Episcopal Church represents the Hawaiian monarchy and Hawaiian sovereignty over and against the United States. This was the political context for the 50th anniversary of the Hawaii missions in 1870, which began with a Jubilee Festival at Honolulu's historic Kauaiahau Church with 2,500 people attending. The records of this event reveal competing visions for Hawaii's future at play. In the pulpit that Sunday morning was the Reverend Moses Kuaea, a preacher so eloquent that some called him Hawaii's Henry Ward Beecher. Speaking in Hawaiian, Kuaea celebrated the nation's progress over the past half-century. He judged Hawaii's rates of literacy, Sabbath observance, and other markers of Christianity and civilization to be equal or better than their counterparts in the United States, in England, or in France. In other words, he used the anniversary as an opportunity to defend Hawaii's civilizational credentials in terms that in an age of a European imperial conquest, an international audience might accept. Now, this message was somewhat different, you'll recognize this picture, from that evening's sermon by the missionary Reverend Samuel Damon, who focused on the pioneers of the American mission. Missionaries like to compare them to the Pilgrims. who he said had lifted the Hawaiian people up from utter heathenism and idolatry, taught them to read and write, introduced the constitutional system of law, and, quote, rallied for the support of the Hawaiian government represented by the Kamehameha dynasty. Observing the rapid transformation of the global order, Damon predicted that Hawaii would anchor a new and beneficent expansion of Christianity across Asia and around the world. But for Damon, the pioneer ABCFM missionaries in Hawaii were the heroes of the story. Kauaiahau Church held more elaborate festivities that Wednesday with a grand military parade through Honolulu ending at the church. King Kamehameha IV and Queen Emma entered last as the choir sang, "God Save the King," and sat up behind the pulpit with members of the cabinet and diplomatic representatives of the United States, England, and France behind them. Then ABCFM Secretary, the Reverend Dr. Clark, visiting for the occasion, gave an address praising the noble souls who here planted and nurtured the seeds of a Christian civilization. The King and Queen used this event as another opportunity to dramatize their status as sovereigns. But in so doing, they also affirmed the authority and status of the mission. Over the next quarter century, through the reign of King Kalakaua from 1874 to 1891, the American expatriate community in Hawaii mounted a stronger and stronger campaign to annex Hawaii to the United States. Through this period, the so-called Reform Party, which was commonly called the Missionary Party because it was dominated by missionary families, advocated modernizing reforms, closer ties to the United States, and ultimately annexation. King Kalakaua is pictured here with the Reciprocity Commission that negotiated a new treaty with the United States in 1875. He was a complicated and controversial king, beloved by many Hawaiians as the embodiment of Native Hawaiian sovereignty, but he drank too much, and many people, both Haole and Kanaka Maoli, considered him corrupt. Many worried, too, that the Reciprocity Treaty and other reforms accelerated the growth of the capitalist economy and the transfer of wealth to the Haole elite. The impossible contradictions of Hawaiian sovereignty weighed heavily on this king. King Kalakaua also initiated a Hawaiian cultural renaissance, for which he is still remembered as the Merry Monarch, that drew the ire of Haole and Hawaiian Christian leaders. He created a government agency to document and celebrate ali'i genealogies, where the hula and other traditional Hawaiian practices had been condemned and suppressed as heathen and licentious. He celebrated them and made them a prominent part of his coronation ceremony and his jubilee in 1886, his 50th birthday party, a 2-week extravaganza that included a parade and a luau with hula dancers that brought thousands of people together on the grounds of Iolani Palace. Through these events, Kalakaua asserted not just his authority as monarch, but also the cultural and political sovereignty of Hawaii as Kanaka Maoli land. Not long thereafter, leading members of the Missionary Party formed a secret organization called the Hawaiian League with the goal of overthrowing the king. Under threat of violence, they forced him to install a new cabinet with their own hand-picked men in charge, and then a month later to sign a new constitution called the Bayonet Constitution that shifted most executive powers from the king to the cabinet and legislature. It also changed voting requirements so that wealthy white foreigners could vote, while working-class immigrants and the common Hawaiian people could not. When Kalakaua died in 1891, his sister, Liliuokalani, was crowned as Hawaii's new queen. As Noenoe Silva has documented, she received many petitions from Kanaka Maoli men and women who wanted the Bayonet Constitution rescinded and replaced. But when she pushed for a new constitution that would restore voting rights to all Hawaiian people, the Hawaiian League staged a coup with the backing of troops from a US battleship. They announced a new provisional government with missionary grandson Sanford Dole, cousin of the Dole Pineapple Corporation guy, as its president. Liliuokalani issued immediate protests and called on US President Grover Cleveland to refuse the annexation treaty, which he did. 3 years later, with the election of a new expansionist president, William McKinley, Liliuokalani and her supporters mounted a new campaign with over 21,000 Kanaka Maoli signing petitions against annexation, and this is one of those petitions. Once again, their diplomacy succeeded just barely, and in February 1898, the US Congress could not muster the 2/3 majority that was necessary to ratify the treaty with Dole's government. Annexation happened later that year anyway, without a treaty, by a joint resolution of Congress pushed through in the midst of the Spanish-American War. The war accelerated the momentum of pro-imperialist forces in the United States and made Hawaii more important strategically to the United States. To the dismay of Native Hawaiians, Dole's government happily ceded sovereignty to the United States, the outcome they had been seeking all along. The first missionaries to Hawaii could not have predicted this outcome, but their work really made it possible, and their progeny really made it happen. Over the next half century, anniversary celebrations continued to play a symbolic role in new battles over how the islands should be governed and by whom. 4 years after annexation, the Hawaiian Mission Children's Society celebrated its Golden Jubilee. Lots of anniversaries. You know, this whole talk is organized around anniversaries. 50 years since the society was organized at the Central Union Church in Honolulu. As its name suggests, this is a society of the children of the missionaries. They took the occasion to defend the missionaries' reputation against the critics, and with it, their own prominence in Hawaiian life. The Hawaiian Gazette described the scene. Upon the platform, draped with Hawaiian and American flags, were men and women who've played important parts in the missionary history of the islands and its material development. These missionary descendants were eager to maintain their place as Hawaiian pioneers and leaders of a new, modern American Hawaii. The big centennial anniversary came in 1920, almost 100 years ago now. Greatly anticipated, as noted here in these two announcements from November and December 1919 in The Friend, the organ of the Hawaiian Evangelical Association. The centennial was observed with a week of events in Honolulu, complete with sports tournaments, several worship services, a series of speakers, including politicians and church leaders, and parades. Really, the fanfare and number of events and cultural productions around this event were astounding. I had enough written unpacking this event to take up the entire hour, and I had to like slash and burn this morning. In a proclamation on the coming centennial anniversary, Territorial Governor Charles McCarthy called on all Hawaiians to celebrate this anniversary as a founding moment. He praised the missionaries as the bringers of education and civilization, bringing the principles of agriculture, land ownership, and constitutional law to the islands, making modern Hawaii possible. I see two complementary impulses at this event. First and most prominently, the missionary families lay claim to Hawaii by placing themselves as the prime movers and shakers of its history, those who civilized and modernized Hawaii so that it could be incorporated into the United States. Here we see the next generation of the missionary families, children dressed up in costumes of earlier times, as the caption says, pictured in front of the new Mission Memorial building, which was erected for the occasion and is still in use. The centennial was celebrated with pomp and pageantry and visible markers of state power. Pictured here is a montage of images in the centennial number of The Friend, of the centennial parade, complete with a marching band, Marines, and a variety of floats displaying the cultural, commercial, and industrial interests of Hawaii. The festivities also included a grand outdoor pageant in an age of pageantry. 100 years of Christian civilization in Hawaii with thousands of performers and a large chorus that chanted the story of the presentation, the history of the mission, and Hawaii's incorporation into the United States, told as a single triumphalist narrative. In the final scene, pictured here, the figures of faith, hope, and charity led a grand procession representing all the Hawaiian people. The racial valences of this pageant are not subtle. These guiding muses of civilization and goodwill are inevitably white. The friend described its climax this way. As the Great Triangle formed, the cast of the preceding pictures grouped itself in front, below the figures of Hawaii and America. At the back, the Hawaiians with their spears, kahilis, and bright feather cloaks, the missionary figures with them. Below these, the industries. These are kind of encapsulating previous scenes in the pageant, right? And in front of them all, the little foreign laborers led by the Pied Piper, the Brown Piper. When they had assembled, the band played the tribute of Haydn's "The Heavens Are Telling the Glory of God." In all, perhaps 3,000 people stood on that hill, telling in the poetry of color, form, and elevation the glory of God. The pageant dramatized the racial hierarchies and the supersessionist fantasies of Hawaii's settler colonial elite. Now, the second impulse, a newer theme, I would say, in the discursive apparatus of empire, was to celebrate multiculturalism as a distinctive strength of modern Hawaii. This is an emergent imperial discourse that might seem quite different from the first, but the centennial events clearly presented the missionaries as the source and the guardians of Hawaiian multiculturalism and Hawaiian prosperity. This scene from the pageant deliberately shows off Hawaii's ethnic and racial diversity, always under the management of the Haole elite, under the mantle of the missionaries. The groups of children seated in the front are clearly marked, both visually and in the script, as Asian. The article explains, in one of the most picturesque scenes of the whole pageant, they're danced down over the hill, led by a brown piper, the spirit of cooperation, hundreds of little foreign kindergarten children, Chinese, Portuguese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, and Spanish. They represented the labor immigration of the last few decades. I took out most of the labor history that I had written into this talk because, again, I didn't want to keep you here all night. But here and in many similar descriptions, the link between industry and immigration, between the needs of Hawaii's elites, business class, for new sources of labor is crystal clear. Now, some of you will be glad to hear that the story of the mission commemorations is not all one of Christian complicity with US empire. In 1945, the Hawaii Evangelical Association held a church service to commemorate the 125th anniversary of the Hawaii missions. Its program gives us a glimpse of a different kind of story. This is one of the sources Anka found for me. Actually, many of these are sources that Anka found for me. Its program gives us a glimpse of a different kind of story, one I hinted at earlier with the Jubilee message of the Reverend Moses Kuaea in 1870. The bilingual program with Hawaiian as the main language of the service is our first clue. All of the speakers were Kanaka Maoli pastors, and other than the event of the missionaries' arrival, they celebrated Kanaka Maoli achievements, with the pastors and representatives of various Kauai churches all contributing to the service. The bilingual program, Bible readings, and hymns are significant. They remind us that Kanaka Maoli Christians had long since taken Christianity and made it their own. Their Christianity took shape in the context of sovereignty struggles and the advent of US imperialism in Hawaii, but despite its contradictions, it provided sustaining traditions of practice for many Native Hawaiian people. Now, I'm sure you can't read this, but here in the notes on the service, rather than a relentless narrative of progress under Haole guidance, as in the Centennial, we see Kanaka Maoli church leadership, Native Hawaiians who've long since made this tradition their own. Here we see that the 125th anniversary of the missions was also the first anniversary of the Kauai Association of Hawaiian Churches, an organization that is marking its own anniversary here and looking forward to its own future. For them, the larger mission anniversary provides the long historical arc of Christianity in Hawaii, but rather than a story of white missionary benevolence, we see Kanaka Maoli Christians and church leaders envisioning the collective work and future of their church. In 1968, the Congregational Churches of Connecticut and Hawaii planned a joint observance of the 150th anniversary of Opukahaea's death, including Hawaiian guests in Cornwall, the site of Opukahaea's grave, and American guests at the Hawaiian services. Professors from both Yale and Andover Newton spoke in the service. The opening hymn, again, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but gives you a flavor. The opening hymn for the commemorative service set the tone. I'll read just a few lines. Not alone for mighty empires stretching far o'er land and sea, not for battleship and fortress, not for conquest of the sword. I don't know the tune, or it's, you probably wouldn't want me to sing it for you. But for conquest of the Spirit, give we thanks to thee, O Lord. God of justice, save the people from the war of race and creed, from the strife of class and faction. Make our nation free indeed. Keep her faith in simple manhood strong as when her life began, till it find in full fruition in the brotherhood of man. In the dual observance and in the inclusion of Native Hawaiian speakers, we can see the real effort of liberal American Christians in this era to honor Kanaka Maoli presence and perspectives. Yet this hymn maintains the missionary narrative of conquest and historical progress and the violence of imperialism that the missionary families had helped to foster, justify, and implement fall completely out of the story. Now, not long after that anniversary, some of Opukahaea's living relatives began to advocate for the return of his body to Hawaii. The initial effort failed. This is an article about that initial effort in 1972. But 2 decades later, at the 175th anniversary of his death, Deborah Lee, a cousin 7 generations removed, spearheaded a new campaign. I talked with her on the phone about that process. She told me about the powerful call she felt to do this work, starting with genealogical research to clarify her own relationship to Opukahaea and the financial, legal, and other barriers that she faced in the process, including opposition in Cornwall. The people of Cornwall had claimed Opukahaea as their own, she said, and they did not want him moved. Now, Deborah Lee praised the UCC conference minister in Connecticut at the time, David Hirano, another Andover Newton graduate who was born and raised in Honolulu, and along with other allies in New England, helped make the move of Opukahaea's body back to Hawaii possible. When Deborah Lee finally brought Opukahaea's remains back to Hawaii, the churches organized public viewings around the islands so that people could pay their respects. Finally, she said, he was back home where he had wanted to be. And this is a picture of the 10th anniversary of the dedication of his grave site back home in Hawaii. That same year, in 1993, the UCC Church issued a formal apology for its indirect role in the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy, following appeals and organizing from Native Hawaiian pastors and church leaders. To its credit, the UCC set up a foundation to go along with that apology, the Pu'a Foundation, set up to address the economic and social disparities still faced by Native Hawaiians today. So the UCC Church these days is making an effort to make some reparations to account for the part its missionaries played in the colonization of Hawaii. David Turner, a YDS graduate and a descendant of the early missionaries who now pastors Crossroads UCC Church in Honolulu, told me on the phone about his struggles to reckon with this legacy. And I quote, "When I sat at the carrel in day missions room as a YDS student, and read the newsletters, what my ancestors were writing about Native Hawaiian people, it sickened my stomach. A sad and horrible history. Yet Turner has come to a position of respect for his ancestors, for their dedication and passion, at least. He has immense respect for Native Hawaiian spiritual traditions and says that all Christians in Hawaii today, whatever their background, need to learn from them. My hope is that we can find our bridges rather than our walls, he told me, to celebrate each other's spiritual traditions rather than defeat. Today, the Hawaii Mission Houses in Honolulu, which is the organizational descendant of the Hawaii Children Missions Society that ran the centennial anniversary, is planning another big commemorative event for the 2020 bicentennial. Peter Young, the president of their board, is the great-great-grandson of Hiram and Sybil Bingham, who I quoted at the beginning of the talk, who led the first contingent of missionaries to Hawaii. To say that Young is passionate about the history of the missions would be a huge understatement. He has written and posted lengthy historical analysis of this history and sends weekly missives in an email newsletter, which I've been receiving for the last 6 months, about the plans for next year, with events planned at missionary sites across Hawaii. The Hawaii Mission Houses, under the leadership of Young and others, are making a concerted effort to reframe this history to provide a voice of reconciliation and multicultural inclusion. And yet, as I see it, the primary impetus is still to reclaim and restore the reputation and the legacy of the missionaries and their descendants in Hawaii. In a recent book titled Unsustainable Empire, Alternative Histories of Hawaii Statehood, you know it? Somebody's nodding over there. American Studies scholar Dean Itsuji Saranillo offers a powerful analysis of the competing narratives around Hawaiian statehood. He argues that liberal narratives of multicultural Hawaii tend to erase on-the-ground political disputes over statehood and sovereignty, and with them material and ideological relations of power and inequity that continue to operate in Hawaii today. I agree. And despite their good intentions, all the fanfare around the bicentennial from the Hawaii Mission Houses, I think, perpetuates this problem. So I'm done here, and I don't have a profound conclusion, except to ask, what anniversaries do we choose to celebrate, and how, and whose voices do we elevate? How can Yale and Andover Newton and the UCC Church today proceed with integrity, not to deny or cover up these events, but to recognize and work to dismantle the legacies of racism and imperialism in which our institutions played such starring roles? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wenger, for this presentation. We're all so very grateful. And we do have time for a few questions. Are there any questions? I can bring a mic to you. Questions for Professor Wenger?
Yes, thanks so much for this enlightening talk. What was the spirituality in Hawaii before the missionaries arrived? It seems to me that it was very intertwined with the king and with the political system. That the king was the representative of the quote-unquote church or spirituality. Could you tell us just a little bit?
I don't think I'm the best person to tell you about that, but I would say, I mean, I do know that, I mean, yes, certainly the king and the ali'i were seen as powerful beings spiritually, right? But you know, what you just said, one could say the same thing about the Church of England. So I don't know if any of the other, some people here know more about Hawaii than I do, really.
Because for us to understand the harm that the missions did, we need to understand, what they were converted from.
Yeah.
Somewhat.
Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. I appreciate the effort and to wrestle with this. And I lived in Hawaii for 7 years. I worked with several Native groups and Christian groups that are perfectly able to hold the tension between the two sides of history, and are perfectly happy with all the heritage that came with missions and the Western blending to Hawaii. And I just feel that it would be good to consult with them, because this is not your history by yourself. You don't have to find the answers alone. And let me pitch here for the non-Western part of this story, because I think there is, I resent some of the language. For example, to call the guy blowing the horn the brown pied piper, to me, I feel so offended when I hear that, because those events and those rituals are deeply important to the Hawaiian people. They don't do this because they are mere puppets of colonial powers. This is our reading of it. But please don't bring the Hawaiians into this spiral of Western hatred, because they don't share the same view. They're able to hold the tension, as I'm saying. The need for freedom and equality of opportunity are not Western inventions or white value exclusively that was imposed over the Hawaiians. The history tells us that the most of the population were done with the highly stratified and cruel regime of the islands that previous to the missionary come. And the whole, the social reform didn't start with the missionaries. It started with Queen Kahumanu, who was a powerful and courageous woman that had, and because she held a higher status than King Kamehameha, he had to crawl into her presence. So highly was the society stratified. And Henry Opukahaya came because he actually took a ship to China and then to England, finally was shipped to the US. And he came because he was running away from people who wanted to kill him, because he had broken the taboo, which is called kapu. He was under a curse to be killed, so many of other young people at the time. So there was a stronghold of cruelty in that they are very grateful to have escaped from and to have broke away from. And to quote Dr. Sani here and James Scott, that also explored the same idea, there's a hidden script of resilience and resistance that was there, and Christianity came giving language to all this need for freedom. Christianity was a blessing, and most of Hawaiian Christianity is completely blended with Hawaiian culture. And the King Kamehameha Day is a highly Christian day, celebrated by all the churches in the island. And I was a member of the first Hawaiian church ever built, the Mokuakawa Church in the shores of Kona. I don't want to take much of the time. I feel this is not, although it's very good in a Western point of view to be aware of your fault, and it doesn't do justice to how the Hawaiians feel about their history. That's just my perspective. There's a foreign there.
Yeah, thank you for that counterpoint to my talk. I think, just a few comments on that. I think you started by talking about the brown piper. I hope you recognize that was not my language. That was the language of the pageant and of the descriptions of the pageant and the stage directions of the pageant that were given there. And I think your discussion of what Christianity means to many Native Hawaiian people, I really, really appreciate it, and I tried to hint at that in the talk. But I also know that these questions are deeply politicized and divided among Native Hawaiian people, and this is a battleground over the legacy of the missions within Hawaii now. So, you know, those, it is, there isn't one way of reading this history. But I thank you for providing that counterpoint. That was really valuable and was not pulled out enough in my talk. George.
Interesting, and there are about 4 students from Punahou School who are probably have something to say about this too, but interesting enough, what your last comment, my sister from Brazil, everything that Tisa has said and everything that you said are both true. Because it's held in tension and it's not held in tension. It's good and it's bad. It's like we get along together, and then, so some of the history that you're stating, that people are embracing Christianity, having served in one of the biggest churches where the gala was held, Central Union Church, as a minister there at a missionary school, Punahou, but also realizing that during the apology, many churches didn't participate. They didn't want to be. They said, no, we were not complicit. We will not be part of the apology. So, I mean, so everything you said is true, but everything you said is true. I mean, it's really complicated. And a lot of it has to do with the beginnings, which so many people intermarried. I mean, even today, intermarried, worked with some of the marrying into families that were very rich, marrying into families that were Hawaiian, marrying into, in schools. If you go to Kamehameha School, if you go to Punahou School, I mean, it's the same thing, all related. And so it's a very complicated situation, and it's not either or, it's both and. It's both and in a major, strong way. So thank you for your commentary, because it's true, and thank you for your lecture, because it's true. They both, yeah.
I guess the first thing, Anthony Trujillo, third-year Master of Divinity student. The first thing I'd say is that I don't think it's for any non-Native Hawaiian to speak for Native Hawaiians. It's for Native Hawaiians to express what Christianity means in their own language and what sovereignty means for, you know, and there's a lot of different voices. So I think that is crucial. One of the questions that I have is, with these movements and a lot of advocacy for Hawaiian sovereignty, what would be the role, say, of Andover Newton or Yale or the UCC Church or other church institutions, knowing the history and how missions have been used to upend Hawaiian sovereignty, what would be the role, more than an apology, to actually advocate and support the desires of Native Hawaiians when it comes to sovereignty? And not to say that there's one unified voice in that either.
Right. Well, and that's, I mean, there isn't, and you know, for that reason, I don't think I can answer that question. I think it's a
question for you. It's actually more of a question for those who represent the institutions.
Yes. Yeah.
And perhaps a question if you come down to the reception that we can discuss further. So thank you.
Thank you. Mahalo nui loa for your lecture. I really appreciate all the work you've done for months and the support that you've had to do this archival research. I wanted to seize the opening that I feel like you left me a little puka to say something at the beginning after the first question. Just to add a few things to what we're talking about here. My name is Kehaulani Kawanui. I'm a professor of American Studies at Wesleyan University, going into my 20th year. And I've just finished a book called Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty that looks at the role of the missionaries in the privatization of land, the pulverization of gender egalitarianism, and the criminalization of our myriad sexual practices and possibilities and freedoms, and how that impacts our Hawaiian sovereignty movement today. In terms of the question about what was there before the Christian missionaries, you use the king as a reference point. I want just to remind people, and this came out in your talk, Kamehameha I founded the kingdom in 1810s. We're talking about an early 19th century construction as a response to Western encroachment. So that can't really be our base, because he did this through bloody warfare. There was already a virtual arms race in Hawaii, and he had to put down a lot of other chiefly lines and chiefs of all genders. Not both genders, all genders, because we have more than two. The other issue I would say is that we have a system with over 40,000 deities, and also that our ancestors are part of the natural world, as are all non-human living entities. And that includes our kupuna, who become our aumakua. They're the kino lau, manifest as the embodiment in fern, in the pohaku, in the streams, in the steam that comes from the earth. So our entire natural world was that religion, and many of our people still hold that and cherish that and practice that. We're seeing that right now at what's at stake at Mauna Kea. Mauna Awa Kea, the highest point with the purest water, the Mauna that touches Wakea, Sky Father, which is also the home of Poliahu, our female snow deity. And that's being pulverized through a militarized telescope project that our people are stopping right now. Keep your eye on it. I'm going to use this time to just highlight this. The trucks are going to start construction any day now, and our people will lay down on the construction roads. This case has been going on for over a decade. It's been through 2 contested case hearings. The Hawaii Supreme Court ruled that construction can go, and people are right now going through training camps to be able to actually stop this, because they've exhausted the Court of the Conqueror as a legal remedy. That is an issue of our religion, for lack of a better word. The R word just doesn't even come close to talking about the Hawaiian world and the Hawaiian cosmos. This language of inherent cruelty is, to me, a racist discourse. I appreciate your attention to indigenous Hawaiian agency, but there's nothing inherently cruel about the Hawaiian world. It was absolutely very highly stratified, but it was also a system of reciprocity and a system of balance, what we call pono. And we know that through the work of Lilikala Kama'alehiva, who learned Hawaiian language as an adult and has tracked our chants, our prayers, our mele, all our pule, to actually show that one of the catalyzing forces of Hawaiian Christianization was massive depopulation through Western diseases, and that they were promised everlasting life, and they believed Christian doctrine, and they converted to try and save people so that we could live. There's a reason the joke in Hawaii is that the Hawaiians looked up to pray to God, and when they looked down, the land was gone. Your lecture demonstrated so clearly how the missionaries shifted from their own goals to become profiteers and make out as bandits. And if we look at the apology from the church, it says we stand in solidarity with the Hawaiian people for justice and peace. You can't have that with land theft in perpetuity. It has to start with protecting the land, returning the land, and stopping the further desecration of our land. The other thing I just want to mention for a research for any grad students in here, Frederick Coxey, who was retired from the University of Illinois, is a profound non-native scholar of American Indian history. He has his own family bound up in some of this history. He grew up on Molokai, and family wrapped up in the management of Dole pineapple, you name it. He found a letter from missionaries, and part of the reason that he understands the ABCFM pulled back funding for the mission in Hawaii, one of the factors, was that the missionaries were calling on people to donate clothes and send to Hawaii, and they found out later the missionaries were selling them. This is who we're talking about. That, to me, says everything.
Thank you. Thank you. We have time for one final question. Yes. Excuse me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wenger, for your talk. I think it's very illuminating. I just wanted to ask a question regarding the parts that you said you had to cut out regarding late 19th century, early 20th century immigration population from the non-West. So how does that possibly complicate? I'm sure there are multiple answers to this question, but how does this complicate the Western missionaries to recover their narratives and the celebrations of anniversaries? So do you think there's significance to their celebration of only the inception, the bicentennial, other than the other possible, I guess, anniversaries that could be celebrating regarding, I guess, various developments of missions and Christian churches throughout Hawaiian history? And yes, that's my question.
Yeah, well, the parts I cut out didn't do nearly enough of this, but if we were going to fill in a much fuller history, we would have to include all the peoples who now live in Hawaii and wrestle with their multiple relationships to each other and to the land and and the kind of complicated racial hierarchies and relations of power that have to do with migrant labor that was brought in from all over the world, as I mentioned, particularly from parts of Asia, the Philippines, Japan, Portugal, many other places, to work on those plantations, on those sugar and coffee and pineapple plantations. And those people also made lives in Hawaii and built communities in Hawaii, and their stories are an important part of contemporary Hawaii. But I wasn't able to really treat that enough today, and to think about the history of. This is kind of why I wanted to put at the beginning that picture of the Japanese evangelists in Hawaii, just to show there's this much bigger story of Christianity in Hawaii that this talk doesn't even touch.
Thank you. Can we offer our gratitude once more for Professor